computer. Okay. Okay, so hello. My name is Mauricio Rivera Ramirez, and I'm very happy to introduce the first of these extension exercises, which are part of an educational project, which is also a game of collective creation, which is titled Warning Systems. And I will very briefly explain the origin of the name of the game, which will hopefully also allow me to explain the aim of this exercise, the purpose of this conversation. So the name Warning Systems, or Sistemas de Alarma, as this is a project that is being developed simultaneously in English and Spanish, is because it's based on a premise or a theory presented by communications theorist Marshall McLuhan when he was studying the influence of television on society. And well, I won't go too much into that. I will add some references to the theory whenever this is published as comments, but I won't deal too much into it. But the idea was that, well, he described artists and art as an early warning system in society. So based on that, I have developed like a lot of my academic and journalistic kind of like work in the last 2 decades, exploring this concept and the roles of art and journalism and communication in general in these 21st century so-called information societies. But to do so, I am kind of like studying a lot of the previous chapters, chapters where not the internet, but other media was the prevalent media, in particular when books and literature were kind of like the prevailing form of communication, at least within certain circles. And the idea of studying Roger Casement, which is the character we're going to be talking about, comes as an extension, this is why it's called an extending exercise, of an analysis that is being developed and part of the game that is being developed around José Eustacio Rivera and the novel La Vorágine, or The Vortex, which also occurs within the context of rubber exploitation in the Amazon. This leads me to the introduction. It's my pleasure and my honor to be speaking with Professor Angus Mitchell, who, I mean, and again, I'll add context of all his background and all his accolades because, again, the time wouldn't be enough. But I will basically summarize how I see Angus's work, saying that more than an expert on Roger Casement, he's the expert. I mean, I don't know how Angus feels about this, but I don't think anyone that I know in the world knows more about Casement than he does. And yeah, no, this is my pleasure to be talking to Angus now. And I will start with a very broad question. I ask him, why does he think it's important for students and the society in Colombia or in Latin America to learn about Roger Casement and his legacy? Angus?
Mauricio, thanks very much indeed. Yeah, look, Roger Casement is a very complex figure in many ways, hasn't been best served by history, and partly because he's a very difficult individual figure to incorporate into the kind of histories that nations like to tell about themselves, because, as you rightly say, he was a warning system. He sent out this very powerful signal at the beginning of the 20th century, basically telling the world that if they didn't stop the desperate levels of extraction that were destroying communities and environments in Africa and South America, then we would pay for it down the road. And in that sense, he was remarkably prescient and visionary, because he really did realize that we needed to take care, nurture, and love the planet rather than endlessly look at ways of generating profit from it. So on that level, Casement has remained a figure of remarkable presence in both the past and the present, in the sense that what he said at the beginning of the 20th century in the reports that he produced, firstly on the Congo Free State, and then in 1912 he published a blue book about his investigation of the frontier region between Peru, Brazil, and Colombia. And in both those reports, he really condemned the extraction of wild latex rubber from the forests that had led to the devastation of hundreds of thousands of lives and millions of acres of forest. And in that sense, he still to this day remains remarkably contemporary. And I think for that reason, he's a figure that can never go away. I think at the same time, once Casement had recognized the problem and realized, and he spoke, of course, from a privileged position because he was essentially a permanent member of the British colonial or consular staff, and was in 1910 when he carried out his first investigation into these atrocities on the Colombian-Peruvian frontier. He was consul general in Brazil. And I think what his reports demonstrate is that essentially the economy, the political economy of extraction is just spinning us into a really, really difficult spot. And 120 years later, we find ourselves in that place.
Yeah, very well said. And I also want to restate on how the alarm that he raised is still so relevant. Can you tell us how does he arrive to Africa in the first place? Because it doesn't go.
Okay. Yeah, his life story is quite straightforward. I mean, he's born in 1864. His parents, his father had been in the British Army. He was the youngest of four children, and his parents died when he was young. They didn't have much money, the family. He was raised by an uncle in Ulster, in the north of Ireland, and he developed a very strong sense of his Irishness when he was very young. But then practically he had to earn money. And so he had, through relations in Liverpool, he got a job with a shipping company, and he started in 1880, in the early 1880s, to make trips to West Africa, where there was a lot of trade developing between Western Europe and Africa. And he then, in 1884, he got recruited in as a colonial officer essentially into the administration of King Leopold II, who was trying to open up for economic reasons in the name of civilization. And I, of course, use that word with great caution, the center of Africa, in order to, improve the state of the Belgian economy and his own financial status. So Casement then spends the next 20 years in Africa in different capacities. In the early 1890s, after he spent about 8 years in different colonial postings, he then gets recruited into the British Foreign Office. He is tasked really with troubleshooting, with doing kind of surveillance work in West Africa, in what has become really Nigeria, mainland Nigeria now, but at that time was called the Niger Coast Protectorate, was a British protectorate. And the more he begins to witness for himself, bear witness to colonial power relations in Africa, he begins to question really the whole colonial project. And really his life then is a gradual progression towards a more and more anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and anti-extractivist position. Anyway, in 1903, he makes an epic voyage up the Amazon in order to investigate the atrocities there. It leads to the publishing of a report, an official report that causes a great diplomatic scandal. On the back of it, Casement not particularly convinced that the official diplomatic world are going to be able to do much about the desperate plight of the Central African people. He helps to set up what is a non-governmental organization called the Congo Reform Association that over the next decade starts to pressurize and lobby government to actually deliver some level of reform and relief to the people of Central Africa. And then, having helped to establish that, he briefly retires from the Foreign Office. By this stage, he's being increasingly connected and interested in the work of the cultural revival in Ireland, which is a way by which the political chaos in Ireland resulting from the failure really of the Home Rule bills has led to this cultural renaissance, and Casement becomes very connected in with many of the main figures involved in the cultural revival. But in 1906, he is unable really to survive without returning to his post in the Foreign Office, and then he's sent to Brazil. And he then takes up a series of appointments in Brazil, first in Santos, the port below Sao Paulo, then in Belém do Pará, and then finally he's promoted to be Consul General in Rio de Janeiro in 1908. And it's really then that his career in South America kicks off, because the following year in 1909, when he's back in Europe, the rumors percolated through that there are these appalling atrocities happening on the frontier between Peru and Colombia. And he then is tasked with going out to Iquitos and to begin an investigation into the mistreatment of about just under 200 Barbadian overseers who had been transported from mainly Barbados to that region of the Amazon, the upper reaches of the Amazon, northwest Amazon, to essentially oversee the extractive rubber stations that were largely in the hands of a single family called the Arana family, and in particular the figure of Julio Cesar Arana, who came from a Panama hat sales. They were initially Panama hat makers from the Montaña district of Peru, but then in the 1890s started to trade with the Amazon, the upper reaches of the Amazon. And then by the early years of the 20th century, they had started to establish a very significant trading empire based upon rubber extraction in the Northwest Amazon. And of course, the Northwest Amazon itself was a disputed territory between Peru and Colombia. And it's really, in a way, that which ultimately feeds into Jose Eustacio Rivera's kind of novel, The Vortex, which, of course, is at the very heart and soul of your project. So anyway, just to finish the story, Casement then carries out this investigation, but it really becomes for him an issue of articulation. I mean, I think this is in one ways that atrocities can be so extreme and unimaginable that they become very hard to articulate. And I mean, we see this in many ways what's happened in recent times in Gaza that there are words just cannot describe the horrors that we're in different ways required to watch in real time. And so what really happens to Casement is then he begins quite a rapid path towards revolutionary resistance through the escalating crisis in Ireland, which has seen the paramilitarization of the country between the cultural revivalists, who by then have to some extent reorganized into a national army that wants to break with the empire and create a sovereign independent country, and the largely northern unionist community who are determined to maintain links with the British Empire and with the United Kingdom. And so in 1912, Ireland is spinning towards civil war. Casement becomes very caught up in that. He, as a result, is he's swept into the vortex, if you like, of revolutionary politics, and he never really escapes from it. When the war breaks out in 1914, after he's played a pretty important part, not only in raising the volunteer army, but in actually arming them and in bringing guns in for the hands of the volunteers, he then goes on the outbreak of war in 1914 to Germany to start negotiating on behalf of Ireland in the event of peace for an independent state. And then when the Easter Rising happens in 1916, which is essentially a local rebellion that really only fires in Dublin, but had been intended to essentially create a kind of show of resistance across the country. Casement returns to Ireland. He's captured in the Southwest Island, having returned on board a submarine. He's taken to London. He's put on trial for high treason. And in August 1916, he is executed in central London for high treason. So it's like a pretty epic life. He's 51, more or less, when he's executed. He's lived this extraordinarily sort of wide-ranging life, much of it dedicated to exposing the crimes and iniquities and horrors of colonial power relations in Africa and South America. And then, of course, he throws his lot in with a revolutionary flashpoint, and he pays the ultimate price.
That's very good. Thank you for that. Can you tell us a little bit about his influence on the work and on the legacy of, well, two men in particular, Joseph Conrad and Edmund Dean Morel?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the most interesting encounters Casement has in Africa is in 1890, when he meets a young riverboat captain called Joseph, gosh, I can never pronounce his name in Polish, Koniowski, who is better known as Joseph Conrad. And Conrad actually kept a diary when he was in the Congo, and the very opening entry of that diary is about how fortuitous he feels that having met Casement, and how what a fountain of knowledge Casement is, who by that stage had been in Central Africa for 6 years, but had obviously built up an enormous amount of local knowledge about the country. And Casement and Conrad remain in contact on and off for the rest of Casement's life. That relationship is quite good at the start, in the sense that Conrad has a very high regard for Casement, but then certainly towards the end of his life, when he decides to throw his lot in with Germany and then is executed for high treason, Conrad revises those views pretty substantively. But I suppose the important point to make here is that it would seem that Conrad's own understanding of Africa, and he didn't spend so long in Africa. I mean, it was months rather than years. But those months led on to him writing at the end of the 1890s, Heart of Darkness. And what is apparent is that Casement was clearly quite a serious influence on Conrad's own conceptualizing and indeed framing of Africa. I mean, you could argue that, as I have done, that in different ways, Casement's own psyche swings between Marlowe, the kind of narrator of Heart of Darkness, and Kurtz, the kind of the wayward protagonist. And I think in some ways, Casement, is an extraordinary narrator of the tragedy of what happens in Central Africa in that period. But at the same time, he also can be seen to have sort of followed that trajectory from the agent exceptionnel, the exceptional agent that Kurtz had once been, to becoming this absolutely kind of savage kind of, I suppose, if that's again a word I use cautiously, but I kind of to take a sort of savage turn on civilization and all its claims. Yeah, so that was Conrad. Morel is really comes into Casement's orbit in the very early years of the 20th century. Morel was a journalist working in Liverpool, and he had really witnessed for himself, but from a kind of clerical position, what was happening in Africa. In other words, huge amounts of ivory and latex, bales of latex rubber were being brought into the docks of Liverpool where he worked. But the boats were going back out to Africa with large amounts of liquor and guns. And Morel began to question, in a way, that equation, if you like, of trading practice. The extraction on one level of really precious raw materials that were absolutely critical for industrialization and the next phase of modernization. And the fact that what was being sent back into Africa were the tools of destruction, liquor and killing machines. So from that position, Morel, who had a Quaker background, his mother was his father was French and his mother was English. And he then essentially set up, through the help of Alice Stopford Green and Casement, the Congo Reform Association, which became a very effective, as I said, lobbying organization that really tried to challenge diplomacy and policy in and around what was happening in Central Africa. And he was a very industrious, hardworking, upright man who, like Casement, died in his early 50s, really through hard work.
But was Morel alive when Casement's execution?
Yeah.
Casement was slightly older.
He was, yeah. Morel, yeah, he was about a decade older or something. Okay. Yeah, about 10 years older. Morel dies in 1924. Okay. Yeah.
And how was his reaction to Casement's trial and the treason and the German affair?
Well, I thought, yeah, I mean, look, by that stage, the war had changed alliances massively. And obviously, those people, and there were many of them, who had supported Casement and what he had done in Central Africa and South America, were obviously not so supportive of his turn towards Imperial Germany on the outbreak of war in 1914. And so Morel, although he was clearly very, never really doubted the integrity of Casement, his own position with Casement during those weeks of his imprisonment and trial and eventual execution were very cautious. I mean, basically, he didn't visit him in prison. As far as we know, he didn't write to him. We do know that he got messages to him that were kind of cautious. But yeah, Casement had become a really, really kind of untouchable figure certainly in Britain in that period, and there was a massive turn against him. So yeah, that was that.
Okay, so this leads us into the controversial topic, if you like, of the infamous diaries that the British government used in his trial, kind of like to defame him, I guess will be the word, and to draw public opinion against him in the trial. I would do, that's my interpretation. But what can you tell us about the diaries? How many diaries were found, and what was the content that the British government used?
Yeah, sure. Look, the diaries are a really controversial part of Casement's life uh, and his trial and his legacy above all. During his life, no one had really in any way questioned Casement's moral authority. He had been a man who had really become the poster boy, if you like, of the British Empire. But then, of course, when he decides to throw his lot in with the Germans, that changes. And he then, at the same time, starts to engage in a conspiracy against the British Empire, which is essentially an extension of his own revolutionary work for the Irish nationalist volunteer movement before the war. But obviously, when that is in different ways transposed into Germany, it becomes really quite quite dark, I suppose is the word. And one of the tactics he decides to use to try and deceive the British Foreign Office and the intelligence chiefs, British intelligence chiefs who are on his trail, is to essentially feed them false information. And that false information includes extracts from a diary that, of course, isn't his real diary, but are concocted entries in a diary that would suggest that he was about to return to Ireland at the end of 1914 to mount a rebellion. And that's pretty problematic. I mean, it's what would subsequently be called black propaganda. I mean, it is disinformation. And he wages a disinformation campaign against the British state, and the British state then decide that they're going to do the same with him. So at the time of his trial, there suddenly appear rumors and references in some of the slightly less believable newspapers or newspapers that more sensationalist newspapers, that these diaries have been found amongst Casement's confiscated baggage, and although they're never effectively shown in the physical form that they would eventually be released in, they're never really shown to anyone at that time. There seem to be these typescripts that are circulated, or bits of it are circulated. It becomes essentially the smear campaign that is waged against him at that moment becomes a very effective kind of series of sleights of hand. It's trickery, it's conjury, and in some ways it's necromancy. You know, it is a pact with dark forces that in different ways are manipulating truth and using highly questionable, if not immoral, methods to actually defeat the enemy. Anyway, the rumors become a critical part in the public campaign to essentially railroad Casement to the gallows, and the rumors destroy Casement's, in a way, moral authority. They completely upset his own defense counsel, and certainly the level of popular support he has in Britain and in Ireland and around the world at that time is completely destabilized by them. But anyway, so he's executed, and then after the war, there is essentially a position is maintained by the British Foreign Office that neither confirm nor deny the presence or the of the diaries. And although there are lots of efforts by different people to actually get access to them, there's no nobody has any luck. And then at the signing of the treaty, when Ireland finally gains partial independence in 1921-22, the two of the principal negotiators of that treaty, Michael Collins, who had been essentially chief of intelligence of the IRA, met with the Lord Chancellor F.E. Smith, who had led the prosecution during Casement's trial. And Collins is to some extent forced to accept the diaries as genuine. And what is actually happening in that moment is that the diaries are being forced into Irish statecraft at the very foundations of the Irish state. So the Irish state itself has always had this kind of very, in a way, both divided and contradictory position on the diaries. On one side, they were forced to accept their authenticity, but on the other side, they've always been highly suspicious of them. Anyway, look, the story around the diaries is very long. It's very contorted. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it. But the simple fact is that I, who have worked on the Casement story for 30 years, have no doubt whatsoever that the diaries are part of a very sort of devilish misinformation campaign. And but there are lots of people who say no, that's not the case. And I have a lot of not necessarily enemies, but people who firstly aren't really aren't prepared to engage with the small print of my conversation or my argument, but also it's a subject that has just arouses too much emotion. And for that reason, people kind of get confused by the actual logic of why they're there and what they're doing, and the basic questions around probability, most of all, but also motivation, aren't really asked. I mean, there is nothing but on any level that can no case that can be positively made as to why Casement would have kept those diaries. I've yet to be convinced by any argument whatsoever. And the probability, because of the disinformation that Casement himself had to some extent triggered, and that the diaries were a response to, seems way above any other argument the probable reason as to why they're there. But we've never really been able to escape from this sort of Manichaean argument between yes, they are, no, they're not, So anyway, that's my thoughts. But look, at the same time, I don't give a damn what anyone thinks about the diaries, really. I mean, I think because it's so emotive, because a lot of people don't want to believe that the British state would stoop to these kind of tactics, which we now know they did in a very persistent and consistent way in the latter half of the 20th century. But some people don't want to believe that. I personally think that the First World War was a total war, and really anything was to some extent enabled and also allowable in the defense of state security.
Okay. Well, now to finish, to wrap it up, can you tell us briefly, well, if you establish or what type of relationship you got to establish with Mario Vargas Llosa, and what's your take on his interpretation of Casement's life in The Dream of the Celt?
Sure. Look, I met Mario Vargas Llosa when he came to Ireland. We traveled for 2 days together, and he was a very, very charming, very suave, very engaging man. You know, I had a really enjoyable couple of days with him, and I have a very fond memory of that. I gave him a lot of background and information about Casement. He took some of it. He didn't take the rest of it. And we had really engaging conversations. I mean, I suppose the one of the you know, Gaze Mario Vargas Llosa was a master of intertextuality. He loved these kind of intersections of stories and narrators. And, you know, one of the figures who was a very close friend of Conrad's was a Scottish nationalist member of parliament who spent a lot of time in South America, a guy called Robert Bonteen Cunningham Graham. He appears actually as a figure in Vargas Llosa's book, The War of the End of the World. And Bonteen Cunningham Graham had, interestingly enough, more or less plagiarized into a kind of accessible English version the life of Antonio Conselheiro, who, of course, is the protagonist of Euclides da Cunha's Os Sertões, which translated as Rebellion in the Backlands, which in different ways, rather like José Eustacio Rivera's El Voragine, La Voragine, is a kind of classic of early 20th century South American literature. And so Vargas Llosa was also really interested in, you know, the whole trope of forgery. But he was also interested in sexuality and his. I mean, I never really thought very much of his novel on Casement. I mean, I had read some of his books, a good few of them over the years. I mean, The War of the End of the World, I loved. El Hablador, which is about the indigenous world, I think is a great book. And the Feast of the Goat is also an epic. I just don't think he had in a way the instinct to tell that story properly. And I think in the end, you know, towards the end of his life, Mario Vargas Llosa had become very much a figure of very much took up a kind of political position in terms of his own view of the world. And I suppose Casement's position on a number of things, especially around you know, anti-colonial human rights and I suppose extraction would not have really appealed to Vargas Llosa. And I suppose the other interesting reason that Vargas Llosa was taken by that story is, of course, he had himself undertaken an investigation of the massacre, I think, of an indigenous community right back in his 20s. And so in that sense, he also had a kind of vested interest in terms of understanding the story through his own lens. But yeah, but look, that said, although I might differ on Vargas Llosa's view of Casement, that didn't make him any less of a engaging and fascinating figure.
Yeah, I don't know if you ever heard that there was this project that never happened of like a four-handed novel written between Vargas Llosa and Garcia Marquez that they they say they plan to write about the war between Colombia and Peru in 1932, consequence of all of these and the robber and the territorial dispute. But there's like a lot of legend behind it because then they got into this massive fight that lasted all their lives. And there's also a lot of speculation about the reason of that fight, whether it was a love triangle affair or it was political. Well, nothing that relates to this issue, but they did have that interest of telling that story from the Peruvian and the Colombian. And it would have been, I guess, a wonderful book if they had actually produced it. But yeah, that's a topic that kind of like connected them, the two Nobel laureates from South America. Yeah.
No, that would have been a very interesting project. And
Mm-hmm.
again, I suppose where this whole story remains so fascinating is that it is like it has this sort of magnetism. I mean, what always amazes me is just how the Casement story never goes away. It is being, even your own intervention now is another retelling. Okay, Casement may not be the kind of principal figure within your warning system, but he's one of the principal voices within that warning system. And one has seen Peruvian, Colombian, Brazil. I worked with Brazilians over the last 2 decades on this story because, of course, Brazil at the beginning of the 20th century forged a massive government fortune on the back of the taxing of rubber exports. So there's a great interest in Brazil for the story. And then it also touches, of course, on Bolivia and Venezuela and Ecuador, and it doesn't matter. I mean, even anthropologists studying the shamanic world have over the years contacted me in different ways about how this story remains alive within that other dimension of shamanic vision painting or visions. So the thing is that in different ways, although Casement embodies this massive tragedy, and the West is doing its utmost to forget that tragedy, whether it was what happened in the Congo from the 1880s through to right through really until the 1960s and beyond. I mean, really, what we see in the Congo now is still essentially a resonance of what happened to the Congo in the late 19th century. And I'd say you can make a similar argument for really what's happening in the Northwest Amazon, in that frontier region now between Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. So it's a story that just won't go away. It will continue to attract storytellers. The forging of the diaries, I suppose, on one level has started to backfire because they were intended in many ways just to shut Casement down. And now what's happening is that they're just drawing more and more attention to him. I mean, you yourself know, in the very fact that you asked me that question, have understood that that whole level of sexual narration that covers his life is again another critical dynamic in his interpretation. So in that sense, yeah, he's here to stay, I'm afraid.
Well, Angus, thank you very much for your time and your knowledge. Very, very valued. And yeah, I will of course keep in touch and show you what comes out of this conversation. Lovely, lovely talking to you, and very, very enriching this
Yeah, Mauricio,
conversation.
thanks a lot, and really good luck with your project. And yeah, please do keep me in touch, and I'll hopefully use it if I can as a teaching tool myself. So,
Okay?
yeah,
Mhm.
that's great.
Lovely.
Okay, take care, my friend.
You too. Have a lovely
Ciao, ciao.
evening. Ciao.
Yeah, same to you.